I'm going to talk about this unusual and very tasty vegetable called celeriac or celery root. It is in the celery family, but it's very, very different. It's dense and sweet and has an earthy flavor. It can be used like a potato actually often, but it is funny looking and it takes a little bit of work to get into. It is a vegetable that stores really well. It's commonly found in the markets in wintertime and spring. And it stores in the fridge for really up to 3 or 4 weeks if you have it in a loose plastic bag and you don't wash it or trim it before you store it. It keeps really well. This one has been in the fridge for about a month. So I'm going to show you how to get into it. So often you'll find it has more root and more maybe stem coming out of it. So you'll want to chop all of that off. And now you want somewhat of a flat surface for it to set on. So we're going to flatten this a little bit more. Now we have a nice flat surface, and we're going to cut it in half. You have to work a little bit. Be careful. Good, heavy, sharp knife is important. Work your way around. And now we have this beautiful, creamy, white interior that's quite dense. It might have a little soft spots in the middle, but that's typical and is not a sign of it having spoiled. If it's really soft and discolored, then it might be. So in order to peel it, I find the easiest thing to do is lay it flat on the cutting board. And then a vegetable peeler really isn't tough enough for this, and it's too uneven. So I take the same sharp knife. You have to angle it a little to get around the top. And you can carefully lift it up to get the top spots. And there we go. So now we have a nice peeled half of a celeriac that we can prepare in a couple of different ways. So I'm going to show you 3 different ways to cut it up. You can cube it, which we're going to do first. You want to start with cutting it into slabs, and then you can lay the slabs flat, cut them lengthwise, and then crosswise. And you have cubes, and we'll talk about how to use those in a minute. Or you can cut them into batons, which is just a little faster, which I do, which we'll talk about how to use those as well, just like that. Or you can grate it for using it raw. And I like to use a box grater. You can certainly use your food processor, the grating attachment, or you can julienne it or use any tool you'd like to do that. But I like the box grater just because it's fast. So now we've seen how to prepare it in a couple of different ways, and now we're going to talk about how to use that in recipes. So with the grated celery root or celeriac, we are going to make a remoulade, celery root remoulade, which is a classic French preparation of celery root. And it's eaten as a side dish, as sort of a condiment. You could have it alongside, it's kind of like a slaw, really. It's very much like a slaw, just using grated raw celery root. So now we're going to make the dressing, which classically is made with all mayonnaise, which is delicious, but I happen to like mixing mayonnaise and yogurt, just plain whole milk yogurt. It gives it a little more tang, and it's a dressing that's tangy anyway. So do a little bit of yogurt and a little bit of mayo, and you can eyeball this. I do about 50-50, half and half, and then it gets, mustard is really the classic ingredient, and you can use whole grain or Dijon or both. I'm just going to use some whole grain there. And you want to use plenty of mustard, and then either lemon juice or some vinegar. Use a little vinegar. It's quite tart, and salt and pepper. And that's really it. You can also, there we go. You can also add some capers or a little bit of parsley, which gives it a nice color. So here's our dressing. This is our remoulade. That will just go on the grated celery root, and this is what it looks like when you toss it all together. I prepared a little bit of it ahead of time. It is delicious if you can let it sit for a few minutes to let it absorb the flavors. So this is something that you might want to serve with meat or fish or vegetables. It's good with beans or roasted potatoes. So there's some celery root remoulade to try. So now we're going to make a pureed celeriac soup with the celeriac that we cubed. And soup is a wonderful warming dish to make in the winter when you're going to find celeriac, and it purees into a really silky, delicious soup that you can top with lots of different things. So all it entails is a leek or just an onion. If you only have an onion is great, but onion and leek if you have it. We'll dice those. That gets sauteed with a little bit of garlic. And then you add water or broth, and you can add chicken stock to make it richer or just use water. You salt that and you simmer that until it's all nice and tender. So now we just have our vegetables that are tender in their broth. And now all we're going to do is use an immersion blender to puree it, or use a food processor or blender. Make sure if you're doing it hot and you're using those to be very careful. And I'm going to put on an apron to do this because it might splatter. All right. So now we blended it and it's really creamy, and you can thin it out. If it's a little thick, you can thin it out with a little bit of water or milk or cream or stock. And now we're just going to give it a little grind of pepper, a little drizzle of olive oil, and some fresh bread. It's going to be really good. So there's your celery root soup. So with the baton-shaped celery root that we cut up, I tend to just saute it. You can roast it, which is equally delicious, just with a little bit of salt and olive oil at high temperature, like 400 or 425. But I tend to do it on the stovetop, just in a skillet, because it's so quick. So occasionally you want to just turn them around a little bit so that you get even browning. This really only takes about 7 or 8 minutes or 10, depending on how big you cut your celery root. So it's a really quick way to enjoy it. And here we have our sauteed celery root. It just takes a few minutes on the stovetop, and you can finish it with a little squeeze of lemon, give it another sprinkle of salt and pepper, and serve it as a side dish. As I mentioned earlier, celeriac can be used often where you would use potatoes, or you can use it with potatoes. You could make a mash where you steam or boil the potatoes and the celeriac, and then mash it with butter, cream, salt, pepper, just like you would regular mashed potatoes. And it's really, really good and gives a nice variation. So you can do that. You can also pair it with potatoes again, or other root vegetables like parsnips or rutabaga, and slice it thinly and do a gratin. So layer it in a casserole with some cheese or some spices and herbs, top it with some breadcrumbs. That makes a really nice, hearty, sort of vegetarian main dish even. So with those ideas, as well as the remoulade, which is really like a slaw, and a soup, and just simply sauteed or roasted, celery root really gives you a lot of different options to enjoy. And it's a vegetable, again, that stores really well, keeps its flavor. You want to pick one that's nice and dense and heavy for its size, and then get creative with it.